Hey, it's Terry with Something Spooky. This is another video about The Invisible Man 2020. I have quite a few videos about it going up right now, but in this one I'm going to specifically be talking about the idea of the Invisible Man being a COVID monster. And I want to start by saying that this is with all due respect, and I am not saying this lightly. COVID has, of course, taken many lives and changed the way all of us in the world live. So I'm not saying this in a joking way. I'm not saying this to be in any way just controversial or, disrespectful. So I just want to say that this is with all respect. But I think it's important to talk about because horror carries, universal truths and fears. That's what it is. That's why we consume it. That's why it exists. Anytime you read any kind of psychological evaluation of horror fans or why horror exists, it's always about this idea that we are confronting things that scare us and confronting the unknown. And monsters in particular, a lot of the time represent the worst of us and the worst of the world. And just, they are embodiments of threats and bad things in the world. And, this goes back to primitive man, the way primitive man would explain nature and threats out in the wild and the dark. And, that's where a lot of legends and folklore came from. And they were serious things. A lot of horror is based on things that have taken lives and cost lives. And so that is part of how we understand it. It's that way for mankind to kind of express and reflect on these things. So Frankenstein and the Invisible Man in particular, confront scientific anxiety, especially at their times originally in the early 20th century. That was a very real conversation happening at the time. And that has continued through horror. There's things like Godzilla, which, while it's become such a fun thing, started out as this very somber reflection on nuclear devastation and basically, the prospects of a nuclear apocalypse. And that's what Godzilla was. So all horror examines death and scary things in the world. I also want to make sure that I say that this was not the filmmaker's intention. It could not have been, because the film was shot in the summer of 2019 and actually had been planned for years before that, going back to a time that it was going to be part of the Dark Universe with Johnny Depp in the role. So it's been in production for a long time. It was shot last year. I'm not making the case at all that this was the intention of the filmmakers. They actually talk in the special features of the film that their intentions had more to do with social media and online harassment. And that you can definitely see in the movie as well. In fact, I think that kind of becomes more of a clear message as the Invisible Man in the movie becomes more of a tangible entity. You definitely get more of that message and more of that feel. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to speak about with it being attached to the COVID times that we are living in are earlier in the movie, before we really get a real grasp on the Invisible Man. But so the filmmakers intended it mostly to be this commentary on the way people can hide behind screens now and hide kind of in plain sight and attack people and harass them. So there's a lot to talk about and think about in the movie in those regards too. And I think they did a pretty good job of, portraying those without being overly blunt with them. So it's a good, thinker. But so I think what was happening here with the coincidence of the timing of this movie, it was released in theaters in February. So right at the time that the pandemic was about to really, seize the world. In fact, the film was one of the first that was released to home video early because its theatrical run had been cut short by the pandemic. So they had made it available on streaming sites where you could rent it at a premium rate, I think just 4 weeks after its theatrical release. So it's one of these things, I think, a little bit where art reflects life, and a lot of it is just interpretive. It's not something that you would think about if you weren't kind of looking for it, but the fact that it's there is interesting, and we've seen these kind of parallels in art and history before. So, the central idea is that obviously there's an unseen, invisible threat, and that's an easy parallel. You kind of just close the book there, because it's all right, the Invisible Man is invisible, the threat of the COVID virus is invisible, got it. That's basically what it boils down to. That's the truth of it, but it is deeper than that. When you actually watch the movie, you feel it more. This had kind of already occurred to me going into the movie. I've always liked the Invisible Man as a monster, as a universal monster, but it never really felt scary or threatening. I didn't ever feel like I got him. And I'm actually going to make another video about how I think the Invisible Man 2020 is better than the Invisible Man 1933, I believe it is, the original film. So look for that video. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more. But the idea is basically that this Invisible Man feels like a new kind of threat, and it makes sense for this character, in a way that it never had before. It makes the idea of this character scary. And it's, like I said, especially in those opening scenes, where it just hangs oppressively in the air. You know, you just, like, you look at everything around the character, everything in the environment, and anything could be a threat, because, you know that the Invisible Man could be there at the screen. You could be looking at it, him, whatever, but, you don't see it. So it's like this threat that's hanging in plain sight, and just kind of feels very oppressive, just like kind of saturating the air. And it really captures it in the early scenes. I think specifically the most obvious one is the scene where she's in the house and she goes out to get the mail. I'm not going to say too much more, but, like, just her leaving her house feels unsafe. And that's portrayed in the way that the film is done, like in the actual filmic qualities, where, you like her opening the door. As soon as she opens the door, you're like, oh, well, she could have just let him in. She could have just let this unseen invisible force into her house just by opening the door. And, it just makes you aware. It makes you feel unsafe just by her, like, running to the mailbox and back. And she comes right back into the house and closes the door and locks the door. And I think a lot of people would probably be able to recognize that feeling right now. And that's part of what makes this such an interesting parallel, and why, it's important to recognize these things in art and horror. Because it's just a feeling that we've all started to adapt to a little bit, to some degree at least. And, we see it throughout the movie. There's just a lot of scenes where you're looking at a corner and there's nothing there. You're looking at a chair and there's nothing there, but you know that there could be something there. You know that the threat might be right there. And just like the character, you don't know if it's there. You don't know if if it's going to suddenly attack or strike. But it just is always present, even if it's not. Even if it's not actually there, the idea of the threat is hanging in every scene. There's also the idea, and I won't dwell on this too long, but that she herself says that she exposes the people in her life to this threat, like that she is kind of contaminated in a way that Adrian, the Invisible Man, is fixated on her, and by her involvement with anybody else in her life, he starts to kind of get involved with them. And so she feels, like she says in the movie, that, she is exposing people to this threat and kind of transferring the Invisible Man from people through her life. So, again, I just want to, be clear that this is not in any way lightly taken. I think this is what horror is in a lot of ways, and it's what makes it important as an art form. So, with respect, consider this angle. If you haven't seen the film, keep it in your mind when you watch it. If you have seen it, maybe go back and see if you have any of your own thoughts on this, because it's one way that we can all process everything that we've gone through and everything that's going on. So, The Invisible Man 2020 just feels like a very timely movie, and it is not the intention of anybody. It just worked out that way, and that's the way a lot of these things often do. So let me know what you think. Please share the video if you liked it, if you thought it was insightful, and follow Something Spooky for more. Thanks.